You arrive at JFK after a lengthy international flight 5 months far from home. You're exhausted, jet lagged, thinking about finally returning to your apartment, your job, your regular life. You move through the airport like you've done before, wait in line at immigration, and when it's your turn, you give the officer your green card. He scans it. The machine beeps, but instead of the quick nod you expected, the officer hesitates and looks at the screen. His expression shifts. He looks back at you and says something that instantly makes your stomach sink. Step aside for a moment. Another officer approaches holding a small tablet. He gestures toward a camera. Face forward. Don't move. Don't grin. A flash. Your photo is taken. You assume it's just standard security. But what most travelers don't realize is that this photo is not just a picture. It's part of a biometric travel system that is now logging every time you enter or leave the United States. And in the last few months, something new has started happening at airports across the country. Green card holders who thought everything was fine are suddenly being flagged by the system the moment their card is scanned. A red marker appears on the officer's screen. A number shows up next to their name. Sometimes it's 183 days, sometimes 190, sometimes more. And within seconds, the officer asks the one question that has the power to change everything. Why were you outside the United States for so long? What happens in the next 5 minutes can determine whether you walk out of that airport and go home, or whether your green card is taken and your future in America suddenly becomes uncertain. Most people believe the danger is the biometric photo itself. But that's not the real pitfall. The real pitfall is what the computer already knows about your travel history before the officer even speaks to you. Because the moment that card was scanned, the system pulled up a complete timeline of your exits and entries. Every departure, every return, every day spent outside the country. And if that number crosses a certain threshold, the officer's role instantly changes. What used to be a routine entry check can suddenly turn into a legal review about whether you abandoned your residence in the United States. And here's the part that catches people off guard. The officer doesn't need to prove anything yet. Instead, he simply asks questions. And the answers many green card holders give, especially when they're nervous, tired, or trying to explain themselves, can end up creating the very evidence that works against them. People say too much. They panic. They try to share long, emotional stories about family emergencies, business problems, or unexpected delays abroad. They believe honesty means explaining everything in detail. But inside that airport booth, every sentence you say can be written down and interpreted through immigration law. And once that happens, the situation can escalate quickly. Secondary screening, forms placed in front of you, questions you weren't prepared for, all triggered by a system that most travelers don't even realize was activated quietly at the end of last year. So, if you are a green card holder or someone who plans to travel outside the United States for an extended period, you need to understand exactly what changed, why it matters, and how to protect yourself before you ever reach that immigration desk. Because the technology now being used at US airports is not just checking who you are. It's measuring how long you've been gone. And the difference between a normal entry and a serious immigration problem can come down to how that information appears on a screen in front of a border officer. Others think that simply holding a green card guarantees they can return without problems. But immigration law is more complicated than that. And the new biometric tracking system has changed how quickly officers can identify travel patterns that might raise questions about residency. By the end of this video, you'll understand 3 critical things. First, what the new biometric system actually does every time you enter or leave the United States. Second, why green card holders are being flagged more easily under the system. And third, the exact approach immigration attorneys often suggest when answering questions at the airport so that you don't accidentally create problems for yourself. Because the truth is, many people who run into trouble at the airport didn't break any laws. They simply didn't realize how their travel history would look inside the government system. And they weren't prepared for the kinds of questions officers might ask. Once you understand how the system works and how immigration law interprets long trips abroad, the entire situation becomes much easier to navigate calmly and intelligently. And the part most people misunderstand about the 6-month rule is exactly where many green card holders get trapped without even realizing it. To understand why the situation is happening more often now, you have to start with a rule that quietly went into effect on December 26, 2025. On that date, the Department of Homeland Security expanded something called the Biometric Entry-Exit Program. The name sounds technical and harmless, but the change behind it is actually very significant. For years, the US government collected fingerprints from many travelers entering the country. But now, the system has expanded far beyond fingerprints. Under the updated rule, facial recognition photography is now required every time a non-US citizen enters or exits the United States. That means when you arrive at an airport, the camera you face is capturing your biometric facial scan. When you leave the United States, the same thing happens again. And this doesn't just apply to tourists or visa holders. It applies to nearly everyone who is not a US citizen, including lawful permanent residents. In other words, green card holders. It also applies to international students, temporary workers, and many other categories of travelers. Even groups that used to be exempt in older systems are now included. Children as young as 14. Elderly travelers who previously avoided biometric screening. The goal of the program is simple from the government's perspective. Build a reliable biometric identity match every time someone enters or exits the country so that authorities can track travel records more accurately and detect immigration violations more efficiently. On paper, that sounds like a straightforward security measure. But the reason it matters for green card holders has less to do with the photo itself and more to do with the data connected to it. Every time that camera captures your image, the system links the photo to a specific travel event, a departure, an arrival, a location, a date. Over time, these events create a detailed digital timeline of your movements in and out of the United States. The system doesn't rely on manual records anymore. It doesn't depend on stamps in a passport that might be missing or unclear. Instead, it builds an automated travel history that officers can access instantly when your green card is scanned. And this is where things start to get serious because the data collected through this system isn't temporary. Under the stated policies governing the Biometric Entry-Exit Program, the information can remain stored for decades, in some cases up to 75 years. That means each travel record becomes part of a long-term database maintained by the federal government. When you enter the United States, the system records the time, the airport, and the identity match linked to your biometric photo. When you leave the United States, the same thing happens again. Over time, the system forms a complete pattern showing exactly how long someone stays inside the country and exactly how long they remain outside of it. For tourists, this data helps identify visa overstays. For temporary workers, it helps verify compliance with visa conditions. But for green card holders, the implications are different, because permanent residency carries a specific expectation under immigration law. You are supposed to maintain your primary residence in the United States. That expectation has always existed. But in the past, it was sometimes harder for officers to see the full picture immediately. Now the timeline appears automatically the moment your card is scanned. If someone left the United States and returned after several months, the officer doesn't have to estimate or guess anymore. The system simply displays the number of days outside the country. And if that number crosses certain thresholds that immigration authorities pay attention to, it can trigger additional scrutiny right there at the inspection booth. This is why many travelers who thought they were returning home normally are suddenly being asked more detailed questions about their trips. The biometric system itself is not accusing anyone of wrongdoing. It's simply presenting information. But that information gives officers something they didn't always have before: instant clarity about a traveler's absence from the country. Instead of asking vague questions like, "How long were you away?" the officer already sees the answer on the screen. And when the data suggests that someone may have spent a long period abroad, the officer's next responsibility is to determine whether that absence raises concerns about residency obligations. That's where and once statements are recorded, they become part of the official record describing why the traveler remained outside the United States for an extended period. That is why so many immigration attorneys caution permanent residents about something that seems counterintuitive at first. Sometimes the biggest mistake people make at the airport is talking too much. Not because honesty is wrong, but because unstructured explanations can unintentionally create a narrative suggesting that a person's real life may now exist outside the United States. When that narrative appears in the officer's notes alongside a long travel record displayed by the biometric system, it can lead to deeper scrutiny and sometimes referral to secondary inspection for further questioning. What surprises many green card holders is how ordinary explanations can suddenly sound very different when they are written down inside an immigration report. Our residence is still centered in the United States. So when they hear an explanation like that, they may document it in a very specific way. Instead of writing a long personal story, the officer might summarize it as something like, "Traveler remained abroad to care for family member." In legal interpretation, that sentence can sometimes be viewed as evidence that the traveler's primary obligations are outside the United States. Now, consider another very common response. Someone says they stayed longer because they were handling business or property matters overseas. Again, from the traveler's point of view, this is simply being honest about why the trip extended. But when an officer writes that explanation down, it might be recorded as maintaining economic ties abroad. That phrase carries a lot of meaning in immigration law because one of the key questions officers examine is whether a permanent resident's financial and professional life is primarily based in another country. Even something as simple as saying, "I didn't realize the trip had become so long," can sometimes work against a traveler. An officer might note that the individual appeared unaware of residency obligations tied to permanent resident status. When multiple statements like this appear together in an inspection record, they can unintentionally create a picture suggesting that the traveler's real life may be somewhere outside the United States. And remember, the biometric system has already provided the timeline of the absence. The officer doesn't need to establish how long the person was gone. That part is already verified by the database. The conversation at the airport is often focused on interpreting what that absence means. This is why immigration law includes something called the totality of circumstances test. It's an important concept because it protects permanent residents from losing their status based on a single factor alone. Just being outside the United States for more than 6 months does not automatically mean someone abandoned their residence. Officers and immigration judges are required to look at the bigger picture. They evaluate a range of circumstances that help determine where a person's real home is located. For example, do you maintain a job in the United States? Do you file U.S. tax returns as a resident? Do you have a house or apartment here? It's simply the system verifying your identity and connecting the entry event to your travel history. After that, the officer will usually begin with very basic questions. They may ask for your name, your address in the United States, and the country you are returning from. These questions are routine and should be answered honestly and directly. If the officer asks where you live, provide your U.S. address. If they ask where you traveled from, name the country. Keep each response simple and factual. No additional stories are needed at this stage. Eventually, if the travel timeline displayed in the system shows a long absence, the officer may move to the question that often causes the most anxiety. They might say something like, "I see that you were outside the United States for 6 months and 15 days. You're not trying to build a long legal argument at the airport. You're simply responding to the questions while clearly reinforcing that your life is centered in the United States and that the trip abroad was temporary." There is another moment during airport inspections that many travelers don't anticipate, and recognizing it can help you stay calm if it happens. If the officer begins documenting your answers in detail or indicates that your case may require additional review, they may tell you that you need to proceed to secondary inspection. Hearing those words can feel intimidating, but secondary inspection does not automatically mean something negative is about to happen. It simply means another officer will take more time to review the situation in a separate area of the airport. At that point, the questioning may become more detailed and officers may ask for additional clarification about your travel history or your ties to the United States. This is the stage where immigration attorneys often recommend remembering a very important right that travelers have during the inspection process. You are expected to cooperate with lawful inspection procedures, but you are also allowed to request guidance before answering complex questions that could affect your immigration status. A calm and respectful way to express that is by saying that you would like to speak with a supervisor or seek legal guidance before providing further detailed answers. This type of statement does not mean you are refusing cooperation. Instead, it signals that you understand the seriousness of the situation and would like to make sure you respond appropriately. In many cases, simply requesting clarification or supervisory review can slow the process down and ensure that the situation is handled carefully. It also helps prevent a traveler from feeling pressured into giving rushed explanations that might later be misunderstood. The most important thing during any inspection is maintaining composure. The officers are doing their job, and your goal is to respond calmly while protecting your rights and making sure that the information presented accurately reflects your situation as a permanent resident of the United States. If a traveler is directed to secondary inspection, the environment usually changes quite a bit from the quick interaction at the passport control booth. Instead of standing in a line of arriving passengers, you may be asked to sit in a waiting area while officers review your travel history more carefully. Your documents might be taken temporarily while they check records in the system. Officers may review the timeline of your departures and arrivals, and they might ask additional questions about your job, your home address, or the purpose of your extended stay abroad. For many people, this is the most stressful part of the process because it feels uncertain and unfamiliar. But it's important to understand what the officers are actually doing. Their task in secondary inspection is to determine whether your travel history raises serious concerns about abandonment of permanent residence, or whether the situation can be clarified with additional information. During this stage, they may ask questions that seem repetitive. They may ask about when you left the United States, when you plan to return, what responsibilities kept you abroad, and what ties you currently maintain inside the country. Sometimes they will also review databases connected to immigration filings, previous entries, and other official records. The conversation may feel more formal because the officer is gathering details that could potentially become part of an official report. This is why staying calm and answering questions carefully remains extremely important. Travelers sometimes feel pressure in this environment and start trying to resolve the situation quickly by agreeing to whatever suggestion the officer presents. But this is exactly the moment when careful attention matters most. One of the most critical situations that can arise during secondary inspection involves a document that some travelers have never heard of until it suddenly appears in front of them. It is a form used to record voluntary abandonment of permanent resident status. The idea behind this document is that a permanent resident can choose to give up their green card if they no longer intend to live in the United States. In legitimate situations, some people do decide to surrender their permanent residency voluntarily because their life has moved permanently to another country. But problems occur when exhausted travelers feel pressured to sign documents they do not fully understand simply because they want the stressful airport situation to end. Signing a voluntary abandonment form can have extremely serious consequences because it formally records that the individual is giving up permanent resident status. Once that form is signed, reversing the situation can be very difficult. That is why immigration attorneys consistently give the same advice. Avoid signing any document related to abandoning your residency unless you fully understand it and have had the opportunity to seek legal guidance. If a traveler is presented with paperwork suggesting voluntary abandonment, the safest response is calm and respectful. You can explain that you do not wish to abandon your permanent resident status and that you would like the opportunity to speak with an immigration attorney before signing any documents. This response does not create conflict with the officers. Instead, it clearly communicates that you intend to maintain your lawful status and that you want to handle the situation properly. Remember that the inspection process is ultimately about determining whether someone has actually given up their residence in the United States. If your intention has always been to maintain your home in the country, that is an important fact, and it should never be replaced by signing a document in a stressful moment that suggests the opposite. If a situation escalates to the point where officers believe there may be a serious question about whether a permanent resident has maintained their U.S. residence, another important protection in immigration law becomes relevant: the right to have the case reviewed by an immigration judge. This is something many green card holders don't realize. Unlike many temporary visa holders, lawful permanent residents generally cannot simply be removed from the United States by a border officer without due process if they contest the decision. Instead, the case may be referred to immigration court where a judge evaluates the facts and determines whether the person actually abandoned their residency. This legal process exists precisely because the question of residence can be complex. A long absence from the country does not automatically prove abandonment. Judges examine the same totality of circumstances we discussed earlier: employment, property, tax filings, family ties, and the overall pattern of someone's life. In many cases, individuals who face questions at the airport have later been able to demonstrate in court that they maintained strong connections to the United States and always intended to return. That is why understanding your rights during inspection is so important. If an officer indicates that they intend to take action against your permanent resident status and you disagree with that conclusion, you can request that the matter be reviewed through the proper legal process. Asking for a hearing before an immigration judge signals that you wish to contest the claim that you abandoned your residence. It ensures that the decision will not be based solely on a brief airport interaction, but instead evaluated through a structured legal review. For travelers who truly maintain their life in the United States, that legal safeguard can be extremely important. While these legal protections still exist, the environment surrounding immigration inspections is evolving quickly as technology becomes more advanced. The biometric entry-exit system introduced in late 2025 is only one step in a broader transformation that immigration agencies have been building for years. The goal of these systems is to make travel records more accurate and to reduce the gaps that once existed in tracking entries and departures. As these databases grow, they are also becoming more interconnected. Business responsibilities arise unexpectedly. Emergencies appear when you least expect them. For many immigrants, travel abroad is not a luxury. It's a necessary part of maintaining relationships and responsibilities across two countries. And that's exactly why understanding these rules matters so much. The risk doesn't usually appear because someone intentionally tried to violate immigration law. More often, it appears because a trip lasted longer than expected and the traveler didn't realize how that timeline would be interpreted when they returned. A few extra weeks turn into several months. Then several months become half a year. By the time the traveler returns to the airport, they assume their green card will protect them automatically. But the system they encounter at the inspection booth is now driven by data that clearly shows how long they were outside the country. The officer sees the number immediately. The questions begin, and suddenly the traveler is trying to explain a complicated situation while standing in front of a border officer after a long flight. That is not the moment anyone wants to be figuring out immigration strategy. The best time to think about these issues is long before a trip begins. For green card holders who know they may need to spend extended time abroad, preparation can make a significant difference. Immigration attorneys often advise permanent residents to plan carefully if a trip might last several months or longer. One of the most common tools available is something called a reentry permit. A reentry permit is a travel document issued by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services that allows a permanent resident to remain outside the United States for an extended period while still demonstrating that they intend to maintain their U.S. residence. It doesn't eliminate all questions at the airport, but it provides strong evidence that the trip was planned as temporary and approved within the immigration system. Beyond travel documents, maintaining clear ties to the United States is equally important. That can include continuing employment with a U.S. company, maintaining a home or lease, filing taxes as a resident, keeping bank accounts active, and ensuring that daily life connections remain anchored inside the country. These are exactly the types of factors immigration authorities examine when determining whether someone truly lives in the United States. When those ties are well documented, they become powerful evidence if questions ever arise during travel. Preparation also means understanding the timeline of your trip before you leave. If circumstances begin pushing your travel plans beyond several months, it may be wise to seek advice from an immigration attorney before returning so you understand how your situation may be viewed under current rules. Taking those steps ahead of time transforms a potentially stressful airport encounter into something much more manageable. What we're really witnessing right now is a broader shift in how immigration systems operate around the world. For decades, border inspections relied heavily on documents and brief interviews. Officers checked passports, reviewed visas, and asked questions to understand someone's travel history. Today, that process is increasingly supported by large-scale digital systems designed to track movement with far greater precision. Biometric identification, automated travel records, and interconnected databases are becoming the backbone of modern border control. From the government's perspective, these tools make enforcement more efficient because they reduce uncertainty. A computer can instantly confirm identity, calculate travel timelines, and highlight patterns that may require further review. But for travelers, especially permanent residents who move between countries, this shift means that assumptions about travel flexibility are changing. The system now sees the timeline of your movements clearly. Long absences are visible. Patterns of travel are recorded automatically. And the questions officers ask are increasingly shaped by the information that appears on their screens before you even speak. None of this means that permanent residents are being targeted unfairly. And it certainly doesn't mean that traveling abroad is forbidden. What it means is that immigration systems have entered an era where data plays a much larger role in decision-making. Understanding how that data is interpreted under immigration law is one of the most important forms of protection a traveler can have. When you know how the system works, the airport encounter stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling manageable. So, let's return to the scene we started with. You step off the plane after months abroad and walk toward the immigration checkpoint. You hand the officer your green card. It's scanned. Staying informed, planning travel carefully, and understanding your rights are the best ways to protect your status and your future in the United States.